Now from Eyewitness News, a special presentation, Northeastern and Central Pennsylvania's Hidden History, honoring Black history.
Hello and welcome to a special Eyewitness News presentation, Hidden History.
February is Black History Month, a time set aside to mark the contributions, sacrifices, and the rich traditions of African Americans.
In the next hour, we will mark milestones across the decades as we look back at America's hidden history.
We begin in Susquehanna County at the Center for Anti-Slavery Studies based in Montrose.
Perhaps you've never heard of CAS as it's known, but its dedicated staff works to research and preserve the history of African Americans whose dangerous journey to freedom took them to or through Pennsylvania and a new home. Eyewitness News anchor and reporter Mark Hiller explains their mission to highlight African Americans' hidden Pennsylvania history.
This is the AME Zion, Church.
A photo of the historic House of Worship in Montrose, which Sherman Wooden points out, is part of an exhibit you'll find at the Center for Anti-Slavery Studies, or CAS for short. The now vacant church, which was significant to the anti-slavery movement, served as an impetus of sorts in 1996 when CAS set out on its mission.
Maybe we need to start telling the story so people who are coming here may find out.
The story starts with former British citizens who sought freedom themselves from England and found it in the heart of Pennsylvania's Susquehanna County.
They were feeling that no man should own a servant.
Several Montrose properties, including the more than 2-century-old Silver Lake Bank building, which now houses CAS, were used as safe houses where escaped slaves who fled the South on a life-or-death journey took comfort and shelter.
They were all heading towards Canada. But they were finding along the way that there were communities and people who would support them, hide them, and they could work there.
While many ultimately continued on to live in a free Canada, dozens of runaway slaves decided to stay in Montrose. They experienced freedom there and practiced their faith at Zion AME Church, which welcomed Black worshipers for generations before permanently closing in 1975.
So this is one reason that CAS wanted to expand its work, not just with the AMA Zion Church, but to include the Underground Railroad activity that had taken place with both the fugitives and the abolitionists.
Abolitionists like Reverend Jermaine Wesley Logan, the former slave-turned-preacher, formed African-American Episcopal churches and helped usher slaves to safety. But it took research to reveal his Susquehanna County connection.
I became fascinated with him and his family and his work in my church, the AMA Zion Church. And I was livid that why didn't we already know this?
Independent researcher and CAS board member Brenda Cave James is herself a descendant of slaves who made the Montrose area their home.
And so this was very personal to me.
CAS's first floor is filled with exhibits of the events, places, and people behind the region's rich anti-slavery movement throughout a 10-county section of northeastern Pennsylvania. The work here at CAS will soon expand to the second floor, where space currently used for storage will be converted into a conference room to attract speakers from near and far. The mission of CAS also includes acquiring sites in the community to preserve and shed light on what for too long was hidden history.
It's the real interesting thing that we want to be, that insight to let those know what has happened.
For Hidden History, I'm Mark Hiller.
CAS is looking to recruit community members to help with the organization's mission.
Head to pahomepage.com to learn more about that or to schedule an appointment to see all that CAS has to offer.
When we come back, we will head to central Pennsylvania to trace a journey to freedom via the Underground Railroad, which runs deep in the hidden history of Williamsport.
And later, what started as a school project has now become one Scranton woman's quest to find the hidden history in the Electric City. And we remind you that you can learn much more about Black History Month on pahomepage.com under the Hidden History link. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. It's no secret to many residents of the Commonwealth that we played a major part in the Underground Railroad.
We just heard the story of the role Montrose played, but in central Pennsylvania, descendants and historians are making sure the story of their ancestors will continue to be told for many generations.
Eyewitness News reporter Morgan Parrish has the hidden history.
We've worked, we've struggled, but we survived.
Williamsport, Pennsylvania, affectionately called Billtown, the birthplace of Little League Baseball. But Williamsport is also a town that holds the key to a very important part of Black history, the Underground Railroad.
Lycoming County is one of the most historical sites in Pennsylvania, and I mean, what's beautiful about Pennsylvania is the Commonwealth, of course, is very old. We have a huge history that a lot of states cannot boast about.
Lisa Summers, who now lives in Florida, spent a portion of her life in Lycoming County, working at the Thomas Lightfoot Inn in Williamsport, a place where slaves would go to hide on their journey to freedom.
The home had a doorway that was near the fireplace in the main dining room of the home. And if you did not know where this door was, you could not find it. That's how well hidden it was.
That door led to a compartment behind the fireplace and into the kitchen, where slaves could hide from those seeking runaways.
This is a display we have about the Underground Railroad, showing some of the local landmarks and people that were involved with the efforts here to help people who were escaping slavery.
Those who helped the slaves were known as conductors. They told the slaves where to hide and where their next stop or city was on the Underground Railroad. An extremely dangerous mission, done undercover and in secrecy. A passion for freedom which required the bravest, most dedicated individuals. Daniel Hughes was one of the most important local conductors on the Underground Railroad. He was a local bargeman who took slaves on his lumber barge and kept them in caves near his house, right along Freedom Road. Although you can read about this in the local library like I did myself,
to read about it isn't the same as actually experiencing it.
They used whatever was available to make the operation go as smoothly as possible. Something as simple as this bench.
Legend was in one of the houses in Pennsdale, and it opens up and was used normally for hiding or storing quilts and blankets, but was also used to hide escaping slaves.
It was a very dangerous job.
My uncle Thomas Leonard, because he helped a slave, had to leave the country for a number of years because there was a bounty on his head. And if he came back, he would have been in jail.
The descendants of these conductors and collaborators make sure their stories live on forever.
My grandmother she devoted her entire life to making sure that the community, the schools, she was very big on doing presentations in all of the schools, elementary all the way to college level, on making sure that they were aware of the heritage and how the Underground Railroad went through Williamsport.
Her grandmother, Dr. Mimi Sweeting Diggs, is the granddaughter of Daniel Hughes.
She wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of how big of an impact he had, and thus she made sure everybody knew, and it was her life's passion.
And the challenge from one generation to the next is keep the history of the Underground Railroad in central Pennsylvania alive.
We've worked hard to get to where we are now. We've struggled, and that's what has made us who we are today, is the struggles, because from them we have the strength to continue on.
For Hidden History, I'm Morgan Parrish.
You could almost get lost there looking at all the history of Williamsport at the Tabor Museum.
And we've created a link on pahomepage.com so you can learn more about its activities. When we return, the Maryland Department of Transportation has uncovered a secret, a long-forgotten slave cemetery.
But next, we meet a young woman whose passion to find and share the African-American history of Scranton has now become an event in the Electric City.
A Scranton woman has turned a school research project into something much bigger.
As reporter Eric Dable shows us now, piece by piece, the 25-year-old is unearthing the hidden history of African Americans.
I just want them to be proud of who they are.
Glynis Johns spends a lot of time inside the Lackawanna Historical Society. She pores over maps, directories, and pretty much anything else that she can get her hands on to help explain the history of African Americans in the city of Scranton. Johns started in 2016 as part of a graduate research project.
I wanted to know how long African Americans were here, and I found we were here for a long time, since 1800, and it's been amazing. It's made me feel like this city is mine. I've had more pride in my identity, more pride in the city.
Johns has developed an online database at blackscranton.com. Her school project has turned into something much bigger.
I told myself, like, I can't keep all of this magical history to myself. I cannot leave it in these pages. So from there, I came back to the community and wanted to share it in any way possible.
When Johns first started on her journey, she visited libraries and the Historical Society. She found a lot of information on the Civil War, railroading industry, and coal mines, but not much on her ancestors.
The Black history is a little harder to dig into because it wasn't thought to be important in the beginning of the last century. People weren't paying attention to that story, so now we have to go backwards in time.
Glynis Johns has now received a grant to continue her work. She's researched and uncovered information about Black business leaders and role models from the Electric City. One of the most interesting things she says she's discovered is in the 1880s, only about 15 years after slavery ended, 20 African American men formed their own fire company in Scranton's Hill section.
These Black men got together and organized this volunteer company. Was credited for saving hundreds of lives. They tried to be incorporated into the fire department. It didn't really go so well.
She's also dug up information on the city's first African-American mail carrier, George A. Jones.
He would write mail for people because during this time a lot of people didn't know how to read and write. And again, for African Americans, that is an incredible, incredible thing.
Finding all of this information hasn't been easy. Johns has had to dig and dig through historical documents, but it has become a labor of love for her.
I'm hoping that we get more interest from the community itself, where they will participate and share their stories with us.
Johns doesn't know where all of her research will take her. Her goal, however, is clear. She's hoping to one day be able to open a Black culture center in the city of Scranton.
I want there to be a space where people can come and look through stacks of archives specific to Black history and find whatever they need, a space to learn, a space to be creative.
In Scranton, I'm Eric Dable for Hidden History.
And when not working on her Black Scranton project, Glynis Johns is also an undergraduate sociology professor.
She's also a substitute teacher in the Scranton School District.
History, no matter where you live or what culture you study, is sometimes hard to discover. That's because often that history is oral, no records, nothing written down about what happened hundreds of years ago.
But sometimes you get lucky. Recently, a long-forgotten slave cemetery was discovered in Crownsville, Maryland. Eyewitness News Washington correspondent Morgan Wright has our story.
Deep in the forest, sisters Wanda Watts and Shelley Evans walk in the footsteps of their ancestors.
I just want to know for sure where they come from. It's one thing to know that you're from Baltimore, Maryland, but we know that our ancestry goes much further back.
The two women share a frustration common to many African Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in America.
As African Americans on this continent, we have no history. We begin and we end here.
But thanks to a recent and accidental discovery, the sisters may have uncovered their family's hidden history on this piece of land.
My 3 times great-grandmother was born here, that Thomas Burley, purchased her.
Evans and Watts are the descendants of slaves who lived, worked, and may have died here on what was the Belvoir Plantation. Dr. Julie Shablitsky is the chief archaeologist with the Maryland Department of Transportation.
When we first came here to Belvoir, we were initially looking for the Rochambeau encampment, which was during the American Revolution.
But instead, they found slave quarters, built in the 1780s and lived in until emancipation in 1864, plus artifacts, bits and pieces left behind by the men, women, and children that worked and lived off this land. The land was a tobacco plantation, once owned by relatives of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. A former resident of the property tipped Dr. Shablitsky's team off to what they thought could be a slave cemetery tucked along a ravine deep in the woods.
And a lot of times when you're looking at places where people didn't have money for grave markers, such as an enslaved community, oftentimes they'll use wood or even local stones to mark the places of their loved ones.
They found nearly half a dozen pieces of broken marble and stones resembling grave markers thrown around the location. But to be sure, Dr. Shablitsky brought in cadaver dogs. Once they picked up a human scent, they confirmed it was a cemetery. The sisters take comfort knowing this may be the final resting place of their ancestors.
For me, it was the knowledge of them being buried someplace rather than being tossed away.
But even so, they may never know for certain if their family is actually buried here at Belvoir.
I'm not sure we'll be able to find that information out because, you know, if they do something where they can extract DNA, it may not, you know, be enough to, you know, compare it with mine.
We don't know if there are only 6 people there or a dozen or 2 dozen. We're really not going to know that unless we do some sort of an archaeological excavation to delineate the cemetery.
The sisters say this has been a liberating experience.
Other, you know, relatives could be buried here, and that's what has me very excited, you know. And I don't know if we'll ever find that out or not, but, you know, I'm here every step of the way.
The sisters' journey through this sacred ground takes them back to a darker time in our nation's history. But they are grateful that it has shed light on their family history and their heritage. In Crownsville, Maryland, Morgan Wright.
Still ahead, an important player in Wilkes-Barre's Black history, William Thomas. It's a name few know, and we're going to tell you why.
Then the National Law Enforcement Museum in Washington, D.C. raises awareness about the hidden history of law enforcement.
Law enforcement agents are tasked with protecting communities, but throughout history, we've seen mistrust between certain groups and the police.
A museum in Washington, D.C. hopes to improve those relations by highlighting the story of one man's impact in the South. Eyewitness News Washington reporter Bree Jackson has his story.
This badge, these sunglasses, and this nameplate belong to a pioneer in law enforcement and civil rights. Lucius Emerson was the first African-American sheriff elected in the Deep South since Reconstruction.
Before that, a largely African-American population in Macon County was not able to vote for their sheriff.
Rebecca Looney is director of exhibits and programs at the National Law Enforcement Museum. She says Emerson was an Army veteran who became sheriff of Macon County, Alabama in the late 1960s following the passage of the Voting Rights Act. She says many saw his election as a sign of progress for Black Americans fighting for equality and against police brutality.
It's a big step forward. I mean, we say that law enforcement needs to reflect our communities.
The museum uses audio and video exhibits to document how Sheriff Emerson worked in his community to improve relations between deputies and majority Black populations they served. While in office, he vowed to enforce colorblind police tactics.
What I mean by that is that everybody will be treated according to the law and no one will be mistreated, no one will receive brutality or unfair type treatment.
Lucius Emerson's story represents a defining moment in law enforcement history. Today, police departments nationwide acknowledge that maintaining and recruiting a diverse workforce is still a challenge.
If law enforcement isn't of the community, then it's not really fulfilling the role that we've, as a democracy, have set it to fulfill.
Recent headlines have focused on the Black Lives Matter movement and the lack of trust between police and the public. Craig Floyd, CEO of the National Law Enforcement Memorial Fund, says he hopes the museum can play a part in easing those tensions.
We're going to have thoughtful, important conversations between the public and law enforcement right here in the National Law Enforcement Museum.
The $100 million museum honors those who protect and serve. The facility features thousands of artifacts, including firearms, body armor, and equipment used for public safety.
I think for most people it'll be a real eye-opener.
Interactive tools and exhibits highlight community policing in cities like Charleston, South Carolina.
The U.S. Marshals Service.
Through programs and open dialogues, Floyd says organizers hope to restore and increase trust.
We realize that there's great hope for the future, that law enforcement and the communities that they work in are doing incredible things to try to strengthen that bond between police and the public.
The museum hopes sharing the stories of Sheriff Lucius Emerson, as well as the stories of men and women of all races who have given their lives in the line of duty, will help visitors better understand the vital role diversity plays in keeping our communities safe. In Washington, Bree Jackson.
More of our nation's hidden history is straight ahead. Sports experts say George Stovey is considered one of the greatest baseball players of all time.
We will trace his history to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, when Hidden History returns after this.
His name is William Thomas, and he lived and worked in Wilkes-Barre. As an escaped slave, he found his way to Luzerne County, and as our Mark Hiller reports, few here have even heard of the name. Here's why.
Scrolling through a computer website, historian Bill Cashadas points out some notable anti-slavery figures.
William Still, who was the free black director of the entire eastern line of the Underground Railroad.
But one image that's impossible to find is that of another William, whose last name was Thomas.
William Thomas, an escaped slave from Farquhar County, Virginia, is the reason for the 1853 Wilkes-Barre fugitive slave case.
While Thomas was on the run from his slave owner, he took refuge in Wilkes-Barre. He found work clearing tables at what was then the Phoenix Hotel at River and Market Streets.
It really is a pretty majestic sight, you know, for the 19th century.
On September 3rd, 1853, Thomas was forced to fight for his freedom while on the job.
Thomas would have come out of this door, down the steps and right here.
He was confronted by U.S. Marshals acting as slave catchers who tried to return him to captivity. They severely beat Thomas, who fought back and broke free.
So he just basically ran down.
Thomas jumped into the Susquehanna River to elude his would-be captors.
He may have gone as far north as Plains.
Bill Lewis with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission says if captured, Thomas would likely have faced a much harsher experience during a second go-around as a slave.
Some of his colleagues who stood here on the river said, "Drown yourself, Bill, save yourself, don't go let them make you a slave again."
An angry crowd surrounded the slave catchers, who quickly realized they wouldn't catch Thomas this day.
They finally had to get out of town. They headed south, he headed north.
Prominent Wilkes-Barre abolitionist William Gildersleeve rescued Thomas, who collapsed in a cornfield. Gildersleeve helped Thomas on his path to freedom to live out the rest of his days in Canada. Thomas is referenced in a historical marker dedicated to Gildersleeve here along Ross Street in Wilkes-Barre. It is the only Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission marker in Wilkes-Barre that acknowledges the city's significant role in the Underground Railroad. But to this day, there is no marker in Wilkes-Barre specifically dedicated to Thomas or any other African American or institution that played a role in our abolitionist history. Cashadas, who wrote an article about Thomas's escape called In Immortal Splendor, believes Thomas would be a worthy recipient of an historical marker.
So Thomas of himself, as an escaped slave, was really the catalyst for a federal court case that pitted state sovereignty against a federal law.
The states lost that Supreme Court fight, which led to a backlash that spilled onto Civil War battlefields and ultimately gave nearly 4 million slaves their freedom. So why doesn't Thomas have a historical marker in his honor? In short, he probably wasn't nominated.
Those nominations come from the public, from organizations, from individuals, and they also have to fund the markers.
A marker costs $2,000, which Lewis says to honor Thomas would be well worth the price.
It would be just a terrific school project or college project or a history project.
And immortalize a man who made history fighting for what we all enjoy today, freedom. For Hidden History, I'm Mark Hiller.
Head to PAHomepage.com to learn more about the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission and how you can submit a nomination for state marker. Candace?
Nick, Lessons from the Grave, A Man's Life and Death is providing a very personal look at what it was like to live as a slave in America. For this hidden history story, we turn to Scott McDonald, who brings us the story of fortune.
In Waterbury, Connecticut, a peculiar headstone. It took 215 years for a proper burial of the man named Fortune.
Your history is in the bones.
In the 2 centuries, his bones have been on an unbelievable journey.
Mr. Fortune, the skeleton that we were looking at,
was owned by this surgeon in Waterbury. He was probably working on his land.
Fortune was owned as a slave.
I think a lot of people don't realize how prevalent slavery still was in the Northeast.
Researchers and students from Quinnipiac University were able to study the skeleton of Fortune.
He was extremely robust.
And gain rare insight into what life was like as a New England slave, from lifestyle to diet.
This feathering along the edge of the skull, it's due to nutritional deficiencies.
Disrespect in life and in death. The man who owned Fortune was a physician.
Bones were passed down from generation to generation.
From generation to generation.
The family used his skeleton to study osteology.
It is kind of a strange juxtaposition to know that, the very reason that he was used by the bone surgeon is also what ended up giving us some kind of evidence of what his life was like.
After 2 centuries, a ceremony held at Connecticut State Capitol.
We participated in the process of the burial, the funeral.
And Fortune's bones were put into a coffin. And through it all, a journey forcing all of us to look at a disturbing past.
Knowing your history means that you can kind of change your future.
For Hidden History, I'm Scott McDonald.
We're talking baseball in a game that is rich in African-American history.
And this guy was considered one of the greatest baseball pitchers of all time, but due to his skin color and the time he played, George Stovey's brilliant career was kept in the shadows. Did you know that one of baseball's best African-American pitchers lived in Williamsport? It was the late 1800s, and George Stovey's stats are what baseball legends are made of. But he played in a time that put him in the shadows of the ballpark. If George Washington Stovey had been living today, he'd be a household name and a baseball player worth millions. But Stovey was born in Williamsport in 1866, an era when the color of his skin prevented him from playing in the big leagues. He played for several pre-Negro League teams, including New Jersey and Philadelphia. Many baseball historians say he was the greatest black pitcher of the 19th century, winning 33 games for the Newark Little Giants in 1887. A record that still stands in the International League. That's the same league the Scranton Wilkes-Barre Rail Riders play in today.
Unfortunately, because the color line was drawn in 1887, he did not get a chance to play Major League Baseball. The New York Giants wanted to sign him, but there was pressure put on them not to sign him.
Lou Hunsinger Jr. wrote about Stovey's life for National Pastime magazine, documenting his pitching prowess. He says the lefty had a wonderful fastball and a mean curve. His career record as a pitcher, 60-40 with a 2.17 ERA. To give that perspective, those numbers would have put him among the top 5 pitchers in baseball in 2018, the elite in the majors. After baseball, Stovey worked at a sawmill in Williamsport, a lumber capital back then. He was also a bootlegger, violating the Prohibition law in 1926. He even worked as a barber, was a terrific marbles player, and could even play the harmonica. Later, Stovey made Williamsport baseball history behind the plate.
He umpired the very first night game in Williamsport on May 14, 1902, between a Williamsport club and a Milton club here in Williamsport. So he was a part of a historic event there.
Even his death had ties to Pennsylvania history. Stovey became a disaster refugee during the flood of 1936, seeking shelter at what was then Curtin Junior High School.
Curtin Junior High School was one of the places where people could go for refuge. And it's my understanding that George Stovey was there and apparently died of a heart attack while he was in refuge.
Following his death, Stovey was buried at Wildwood Cemetery in Williamsport, but because he was considered a pauper, his grave was unmarked, and it remained that way until a local influential baseball fan fixed the problem.
A former Lycoming County Sheriff by the name of Joe Mertz, who really admired Stovey as a ball player, bought a marker for him. It said, George W. Stovey, 1866-1936, ball player.
He was on a list of African-American players considered for Cooperstown's Baseball Hall of Fame a few years back, but never made it in. George Stovey, a local African-American athlete who made history long before America could acknowledge his talents. All right, let's go from Williamsport to Birmingham, Alabama, where an effort is now underway to preserve the living history and legacy of baseball's oldest park, Rickwood Field, for generations to come. Chris Renkel takes us out to the ballpark.
A monument to America's game that has stood the test of time.
There's nothing else like it left. Everything else is gone by the wayside.
Before the Gray Lady broke ground, where the Green Monster loomed over hitters and the vines climbed the walls of Wrigley, there was Rickwood Field.
Somehow or another, Rickwood Field has managed to survive.
In the early days of Birmingham's steel industry, industrial titan Rick Woodward built a state-of-the-art ballpark in the shadows of Birmingham's steel mills. Over a century later, Rickwood Field still stands, now America's oldest ballpark.
Was he baseball crazy, or was he a good businessman? And the answer is he was both.
In the early days of the sport, it was the home of Birmingham baseball.
You know, it's minor leagues have been here forever. I mean, this is the oldest ballpark in the country, and I was lucky enough to play here for 2 years.
The Barons saw future Major League stars pass through their gates on the way to the show, and it was the home of the Birmingham Black Barons, the juggernaut of Negro League baseball in the South.
There's a lot of local people who grew up here going to games with their dad and their granddad. And so they have an emotional attachment to the park.
Through its history, close to 200 Major League Hall of Famers have played a game at Rickwood Field. Names like Wagner, Cobb, Page, and even the Babe.
It's become a bucket list item for a lot of true baseball nationally.
The movies 42, Cobb, and The Soul of the Game were all filmed at this iconic ballpark.
He was born and raised in Alabama and sprinted his way into the record books as one of the greatest track and field athletes. We'll remember Jesse Owens next on Hidden History. His speed and gold medals paved the way for many African-American athletes. His humble beginnings started in a small home in Alabama. Jack Royer has the story of Jesse Owens.
He was born here. He picked cotton right here where we're standing.
This land looks a lot different than it did the last time Jesse Owens saw it himself. Long before the world-famous athlete heard a starter pistol, he spent 9 hard years living on this land in northwest Alabama.
Welcome to the Owens family home,
where a replica of his childhood home now reminds visitors that adversity never stopped Jesse Owens' will to win. The youngest of 10 children, many of them living together in a house like this, a replica on the family property.
They had a hard life here. Nothing come easy for him.
But winning would soon come easily for him after his family moved to Ohio, where his unheard of success at Ohio State University earned him a greater controversial opportunity.
By America's black streak Jesse Owens in the 100 meters. The world's most superb runner makes the others look as if they're walking.
In front of the world, Owens embarrassed Nazi Germany. Dedicated in 1996, the museum displays the history of Owens' life for all to see, attracting thousands of visitors every year, many not realizing he was born right here in Alabama.
People will argue with you about that, actually.
Jesse Owens would continue those impacts until his death in 1980. His birthplace perhaps hard to find, but it's also hard to forget, as the impact he had on the sporting world paved a way for today's athletes to succeed.
Still ahead on Hidden History, how our region honored the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King with a day of service and community pride.
In 1986, then-President Ronald Reagan signed the bill marking the third Monday of every January as Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Unlike many holidays which are looked upon as kind of a day off, this federal holiday is considered to be a day of service within our communities.
In Monroe County, there was a prayer breakfast at Full Gospel Holiness Church of God in Christ in Pocono Manor. The people who attended the breakfast celebrated the memory and legacy of Dr. King.
Meanwhile, hundreds of dedicated volunteers spent the day at Lycoming College paying tribute to Dr. King.
Reporter Morgan Parrish has more on this annual day of service.
I
was off today, actually relaxing, so I said I'll do it, you know.
More than 200 helping hands worked hard to pack these meals up for families in need across Lycoming County.
We're having a lot of fun here on Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, but it's really serious work.
Oh my gosh, I think it's incredible to give back. I think it's really important to give back to your community and to meet other people that have the same ideas.
From apples to hot bowls of chili, the More Than a Meal packing event is an initiative to help tackle local problems and advance Dr. King's dream of opportunity for all.
In the earliest stages of, our ancestors and our grandparents and the parents before them, they couldn't do these things. So now that we're able to do this, we got to grab hold of it. It's another way for us to come together,
Odrin Polk is a volunteer with Step AmeriCorps. He tells me it's a blessing to be able to give back after going through trials and tribulations himself.
I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to do something, not only just working a regular 9 to 5, I wanted to make a difference in my community and my neighborhood.
Students say it was a no-brainer to volunteer on an off day.
We all think it's a good commitment to us, get out there and give back to the community.
And for those who weren't off, they still made the time.
We actually have class. I have class in 5 minutes.
Oh, you do? Louise O'Kine is a senior at Lycoming College. She says although we have all year long to give back, Martin Luther King Day is a bit more special.
It's a time put aside to be able to think and reflect on morals and values that are instilled in us on a daily basis, and just being able to let our light shine.
For Hidden History, I'm Morgan Parrish.
Elsewhere around the region, volunteers braved the cold and icy roads to help out at an area food bank on Martin Luther King Day in Luzerne County.
30 people helped out at the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Food Bank with some help from the Commission on Economic Opportunity, or CEO. They filled 289 boxes with non-perishable foods that will be distributed to local families. CEO officials say 1 in 4 children and 1 in 5 adults in their service area are at risk of going hungry. And some volunteers say they've seen hunger firsthand.
Yeah, definitely in our school, we see a lot of people who could have more, and it just feels good to help give back to people who we see regularly and we know could help affect them in a way.
And if you have the desire to give back, each January you can find many of these service opportunities at pahomepage.com under our community calendar section.
Well, we certainly hope you're hungry for history and some barbecue.
We are off to Dreamland and ribs that some describe as heaven.
In 1986, then-President Ronald Reagan signed the bill marking the third Monday of every January as Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Unlike many holidays which are looked upon as kind of a day off, this federal holiday is considered to be a day of service within our communities.
In Monroe County, there was a prayer breakfast at Full Gospel Holiness Church of God in Christ in Pocono Manor. The people who attended the breakfast celebrated the memory and legacy of Dr. King.
Meanwhile, hundreds of dedicated volunteers spent the day at Lycoming College paying tribute to Dr. King.
Reporter Morgan Parrish has more on this annual day of service.
I was off today, actually relaxing, so I said I'll do it,
More than 200 helping hands worked hard to pack these meals up for families in need across Lycoming County.
We're having a lot of fun here on Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, but it's really serious work.
Oh my gosh, I think it's incredible to give back. I think it's really important to give back to your community and to meet other people that have the same ideas.
From apples to hot bowls of chili, the More Than a Meal packing event is an initiative to help tackle local problems and advance Dr. King's dream of opportunity for all.
In the earliest stages of, our ancestors and our grandparents and the parents before them, they couldn't do these things. So now that we're able to do this, we got to grab hold of it. It's another way for us to come together,
Odrin Polk is a volunteer with Step AmeriCorps. He tells me it's a blessing to be able to give back after going through trials and tribulations himself.
I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to do something, not only just working a regular 9 to 5, I wanted to make a difference in my community and my neighborhood.
Students say it was a no-brainer to volunteer on an off day.
We all think it's a good commitment to us, get out there and give back to the community.
And for those who weren't off, they still made the time.
We actually have class. I have class in 5 minutes.
Oh, you do? Louise O'Kine is a senior at Lycoming College. She says although we have all year long to give back, Martin Luther King Day is a bit more special.
It's a time put aside to be able to think and reflect on like morals and values that are instilled in us on a daily basis, and just being able to let our light shine.
For Hidden History, I'm Morgan Parrish.
Elsewhere around the region, volunteers braved the cold and icy roads to help out at an area food bank on Martin Luther King Day in Luzerne County.
30 people helped out at the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Food Bank with some help from the Commission on Economic Opportunity, or CEO. They filled 289 boxes with non-perishable foods that will be distributed to local families. CEO officials say 1 in 4 children and 1 in 5 adults in their service area are at risk of going hungry. And some volunteers say they've seen hunger firsthand.
Yeah, definitely in our school, like we see a lot of people who could have more, and it just feels good to help give back to people who we see regularly and we know could help affect them in a way.
And if you have the desire to give back, each January you can find many of these service opportunities at pahomepage.com under our community calendar section.
Well, we certainly hope you're hungry for history and some barbecue.
We are off to Dreamland and ribs that some describe as heaven. John Big Daddy Bishop's prayer about how to make a living was answered in dreams.
And in 1958, that dream became a palate-pleasing, award-winning barbecue that's still being served at the Dreamland Cafe in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Here's Lee Garner.
And it was just scrumptious.
It's hard to stay hidden when your ribs are the stuff of legend.
This is Mr. Bishop, and this is my father.
But the history behind Dreamland Barbecue is a little more mysterious.
Now, I can't tell you all our tricks.
Just like some of their recipes.
You know, legend has it there's a little moonshine in it. I can neither confirm nor deny.
But just like the restaurant's famous motto goes,
ain't nothing like 'em nowhere.
There almost really wasn't anything like them anywhere. Because former brick mason and founder Big Daddy John Bishop was contemplating opening a mortuary instead. But as the story goes, his decision was made thanks to a dream.
Better than a mortuary, and we are so thankful that he made that decision.
So in 1958, the same year the Bears started coaching at Bama, Bishop opened his Hillside Cafe in the Jerusalem Heights community in Tuscaloosa. At that time, they served all kinds of things, even sold postage.
But at the end of the day, he always ran out of ribs and he had these other items left over. So like a true entrepreneur, he skinnied his menu down to just be ribs. And that was how it all began. We feel like we're a very good ambassador. You know, food is a great equalizer, food and sports sometimes. And if we can just be a part of that and be a part of people's memories, their fun memories, their family memories, their sports memories, that means a lot to us.
In its 61 years of operation, presidents, athletes, actors, and musicians have all visited the Dreamland Cafe.
We want to thank you for taking this journey with us, and we hope you learned something more about the hidden history of the African American experience right here in your backyard.
We have even more stories at the Hidden History link on our website, and if you have a story that you'd like to share with us, let us know through our tip line. It's all at pahomepage.com.
I'm Candace Kelly.
And I'm Nick Toma. Thanks for joining us.